I'm Brad Johnson. I'm a professor of psychology here at the Naval Academy, and it's my pleasure to be the chair for our last panel today. It's called Eluding Failure, the Catalyst for Change. And I want to just kind of pose a couple of questions that I know members of our panel are going to be talking about. And here they are. How does a leader gauge whether the risk is worth the reward when changing an organization's direction? Difficult question. And another one, how does a leader overcome the inherent resistance to organizational change? Two questions that I think can kind of help kick us off. Our plan today is to go along the panel, allow each panelist to talk initially, have some preliminary comments, and then as quickly as possible go ahead and get to you and your exchange. So be putting away those excellent questions as you hear the different panelists introduce their thinking on this topic. We'll have lots of time for that. I'm going to introduce each of them individually, let them go ahead and offer some preliminary thoughts, and then we'll introduce the next one in turn. So first today we have Craig Malloy. Craig is an '83 graduate of the Naval Academy and has an MBA from UCLA in the School of Management. He co-founded BLOOMFIRE, Inc. in January of 2012, and he describes it as a web-based application, or they create web-based application for those who want to grow killer sales teams. And we'll have to let him tell us more about what that means. I at first thought he was talking about assassins, and I'm sure that's not what he means. He was also a co-founder of Life Size Communications and served as CEO from 2003 to 2011. Life Size is now a division of Logitech and was the first company to deliver high-definition video communications. So help me in welcoming Craig Malloy.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor for me to be here. I'm coming up my 30-year reunion at the Naval Academy, so it's nice to come full circle as a midshipman and then have the opportunity to participate in such a such a great panel. As I was thinking about the topic for today, eluding failure, in my line of work as a civilian over the past since I got out of the Navy, it's been a founding and the CEO of a series of 3 different technology companies, high-tech companies, venture capital funded companies, and in that world there's a lot of failure. There's the technology change is so quick. Why Facebook is successful and MySpace fell by the wayside, and the changes and the obsolescence come fast and furious. In fact, if you look at venture capital funded companies, usually only 1 out of 10 becomes a success. 2 or 3 are the living dead for a while, and then 5 are probably failures. And I've been fortunate enough to have 3 successful companies over the past 16 years. And I would say that first of all, my experience here at the Naval Academy and as a Navy officer certainly was foundational to that experience. I mean, I could not have, I don't think, done what I've been able to accomplish in my career without that foundational element. But there's really, I think, 3 key principles that I've kept in mind over the past several decades as I've been founding and leading companies. And that's really, the first one is, leadership matters, and not just positional leadership of I'm the boss, do what I say, but authentic, present, listening, servant leadership, where your team knows that you have their back and you lead from the front. You don't have to be the smartest guy in the room. You don't have to be right all the time. You need to be there, to lead that team. That's a really important thing, and certainly not to be underestimated. And that's certainly the basis of this conference, to explore that principle. The second is around team. You've got to have a team that complements your weaknesses, and one of the most important parts of being a leader is understanding what your weaknesses are, because you have them. I have them. I'm only good at a few things. Luckily, those are important in my job. But you need to find people that can complement your weaknesses that you can rely on. Again, you don't need to have all the answers, but you've got to have a team around you that can, that you can rely on. And then the third one is although you have maybe a long-term goal in mind, and you doggedly pursue that year after year, decade after decade, you need to be able to adjust within those boundaries. You need to be able to have flexibility, because anything that's complicated or complex is going to have problems. There's the stuff is going to hit the fan when your team is freaking out, and looking to you for guidance. You need to be able to be flexible enough to adjust to the circumstances while keeping that goal in mind. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Johnson.
All right, thank you. All right, our second speaker is David Gardner. I love his official title. He's co-founder and chief rule breaker of the Motley Fool. And I just want to let the midshipmen know, calling yourself chief rule breaker is not going to get you out of trouble here. It's a nice title. One of the country's most respected and trusted sources on investing, David co-founded the Motley Fool with his brother Tom in '93. As chief rule breaker, David wears many hats, including innovator, stock picker, author, lecturer, and media personality. He graduated as a Moorhead Scholar from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in '88, and has received that university's prestigious Distinguished Young Alumni Award. Since '99, David has also been a member of the New York Stock Exchange's Individual Investor Advisory Committee. Help me welcome David Gardner.
Thank you very much. I had the pleasure of talking to my dad as I drove over to Annapolis today. Dad was a Navy man from 1963 to 1966. And he loved his time with the Navy. He was in the Judge Advocate General's office in Washington. He was a lawyer who only ever saw one day of sea duty, his final day, when a friend said, "We really should go out on a boat so you have one day of sea duty before leaving the Navy." I said, "Dad, we're going to talk some about risk today and when to take risk." And he said, "Well, that's an easy answer." He said, from Stowe, Vermont, about an hour ago at the age of 76. He said, "You take a risk when it's going to work out." So it's a fun, and actually, if you think about it, it's not a bad way of thinking about when to take risk. So some great questions. I'll be brief in my opening comments because it's all about the questions and answers for me. One of the questions that you posed was, when be a game changer versus playing it safe? And I hope I'm not the only one in the room who thinks this. I suspect I'm not. But I think that you should always be changing the game. I don't think if safe sounds like inert, there are some isolated examples where that's the right move, but in a world that, as Craig mentioned, that is speeding up and technology is being deployed and developed. The iPad didn't even exist 5 years ago. Google didn't exist 15 years ago. These things are now multi-billion-dollar sensations, adding value to the lives of people worldwide. And there's a wonderful quote from Schopenhauer, the 19th century German philosopher. He said, "Talent hits a target no one else can hit. Genius hits a target that no one else can see." And I think that's very true if you think about whether we're talking about military innovation in history or you're thinking about business right here in the present day. It is those visionaries who often help us take risks, take us to a new place, and often, since they are visionary, they see something that you and I don't. And I certainly, as a rule breaker, which really describes my investing style, I love the companies that disrupt, that come along and shake things up. I love Amazon.com, as I did when I first bought it in 1996 at $3.21 a share. And I also love holding onto stocks, which is what I've done with Amazon.com and many others. In fact, probably to a fault, I tend not to sell. But when I find vision, when I find people who are thinking, who are in fact seeing things that we don't see, I'm reminded of how valuable that is. And I want to quote Google CEO Larry Page, since I'm kind of advocating for you should always be innovating, never settle. He said in an interview just a couple weeks ago, most companies decay slowly over time. They tend to do approximately what they did before, with a few minor changes. It's natural for people to want to work on things that they know aren't going to fail. But incremental improvement is guaranteed to be obsolete over time, especially in technology where you know there's going to be non-incremental change. So a big part of my job, Larry Page said, is to get people focused on things that are not just incremental. He said, take Gmail. When we released that, Google was a search company. If it was a leap for us to put out an email product, let alone that gave users 100 times as much storage as one that than they could find anywhere else. That's not something that would have happened naturally, he said, if we had been focusing on incremental improvements. So I think that is increasingly true in a world where technology truly is speeding up. In fact, somebody that Google just hired, a visionary unto himself, and somebody whose work I've enjoyed studying over the years. I saw him speak, I'll mention his name in a sec, but I saw him speak a couple of years ago, and he said, you know, if you were to look at ancient Egypt, if you lived in ancient Egypt and you were to predict what is it going to be like for your grandkids, you would have made a pretty good prediction. You would have said 100 years from now, it's still going to be about irrigation and farming. We're going to be rooting for the Nile to overrun its banks. I predict my grandchildren will be farming. And that would have been a pretty darn good guess. Over the course of 3,000 years or so, 4,000 years or so, that window of prediction that was safely 100 years has, I would say, by my birth, 1966, I'm 46 today, I would say that was probably down to about 15 years. I would say when I was in college, which was the late 1980s, I would say you could probably make a pretty good call about 10 years ahead where the world would be or what technologies might be showing up. In fact, you can even double check my math on this because there's a really funny YouTube set of videos. AT&T, some of us may remember these ads, AT&T was doing in 1993 a look at where the world was going. And the ad, 30-second hits, would be something like, you know, how would you like to do your next business conference from the beach? And it showed, and it seemed so futuristic in 1993, it showed a guy, you know, on the beach with a laptop that was playing a video, and he was telling people what to do. And the punchline was, you will, and AT&T will bring it to you. Now, as it turns out, you were, and all of us are doing and taking those things for granted today. AT&T happened to be the company that didn't bring it, in most cases, any of these innovations, but whether it was, you know, how would you like to drive across America without a paper map? You will, and AT&T will bring it to you. So enjoy those videos, they're fun to watch, but that was 1993, and those were pretty good. As you watch the videos, you'd be like, they got that pretty right. Most of that was true by 2005. I would say at this point, since a lot of people didn't even foresee the iPad coming out with this success, a lot of people said, this is just an oversized iPhone. I would say the window of prediction has gotten down to maybe 3 to 5 years at this point about making a good, solid prediction. I will hand over the microphone, but I'll say in the investment trade, as somebody who's tasked with picking stocks that will exceed the S&P 500's average, stocks that will beat the market over time, in a way that sounds like an increasingly difficult thing to do in an ever-changing world. I can say that the beauty of the approach that we take at The Fool is that we're looking at the things that aren't changing. And what doesn't change is people, vision. You can change the number of furlongs in the race and you can make it muddy or grassy or anything in between. I'm betting on the jockey whenever I can. And so in a world of ever-increasing non-incremental changes, for me, the safest, best route to taking risk and to innovate is when you know you're driven by a vision or you're working with people that you think are superior. And I know that's something that's not too hard to do or find here at the Naval Academy. Anyway, I'm looking forward to the questions. Thank you.
All right. Dr. Rodrigo Canales is here with us from Yale School of Management. Dr. Canales has a PhD from the MIT Sloan School of Management. His work seeks to understand how individuals purposefully enact organizational and institutional change He's currently conducting research in the institutional complexities of renewable energy and the institutional implications of the Mexican War on Drugs. Rodrigo teaches the Innovator Perspectives course at the Yale School of Management and sits on the steering committee, this is very interesting, of the Dalai Lama Center for Ethics and Transformative Values at MIT, and currently advises several startup companies in Mexico. Help me welcome Dr. Canales here.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for the kind invitation. I'm truly honored to be here. And, I was praising the students of the academy to my escort, and I told them that I can remember the names of every single student I've had from this academy at Yale, because there's something that happens in the academy here that trains people that are a little bit different, and you can tell. There's a little bit more maturity, a little bit more purpose, a little bit more understanding of the responsibility that they have in the world in these students. And so I'm truly honored to be here, and I hope to see some of you sitting in my classroom in a few years' time. As was mentioned in the introduction, I study the question of how institutional or systemic change is intentionally enacted. And, you know, I care about this because if you think about it, the way a system or an institution is set up kind of predicts or determines the outcomes that we can expect out of that system or out of that institution. And so especially when an institution becomes obsolete and when sort of the environment has changed or something has changed where the institution is now not creating the kinds of outcomes that we would want it to create, then we want to know how to change it. The problem is that if you were walking on the street and you bumped into an institution, the way you would recognize it is by its stability. Institutions are designed to be stable. Systems are designed to be stable, usually. So the question of how to change an institution or how to change a system is actually quite tricky. And so one of the reasons why I study institutional change is because I think it's critically important and I care about it. The second reason why I study it is because I hadn't been satisfied with the answers that you usually find on if we have an institution that is not doing what we want it to do, then how do we change it? And typically the answers that you find are of two flavors. The first is, well, you know, there'll be an exogenous shock at some point that is going to shake the institution into forcing it to change. And sure, that's empirically true. We know that happens. But it also doesn't give us much hope, right? Because then we have to just pray really, really hard that a meteor will come and hit the institution that we want to change so that finally it will allow for us to change it. The second explanation that you often find is, well, there are individuals. Sometimes there are individuals who can change institutions, and you know, people call them a lot of things. They call them leaders. They call them institutional entrepreneurs. There's different labels you can put on them. But here again, the problem when you sort of look at how we study institutional change and how we read about institutional change, usually what you find is a story that goes something like this. Somebody recognized that an institution had changed in a dramatic or exciting way. They go and they say, who did this? And somebody points out and says, that person did it. So then they go and they ask that person, how did you do it, man? Tell me how you did it. And then that person and the people around that person tell a very nice retrospective story of how that change was brought about. The problem with that is that, again, empirically, or in reality, institutional change is extremely rare, just because it's hard. It follows that there are actually relatively few people who have accomplished to change institutions, who people identify as like, that's a person who changed that institution. Then when you ask them and they tell you what they did, right, you end up with explanations that seem sort of that are linear, right, where people usually only tell you what they did right, they don't tell you what they did wrong. And you end up again with this idea that, well, this person is just really, really special. People were lucky that this person came around, and it's because this person is such a unique individual that institutional change was possible. And so for me, That doesn't sound that different from a meteor striking. Like if the only way to change an institution or a system is to pray that a unique and very, very special individual arrives, then that doesn't leave us much more hope than praying for a meteor. And we kind of know that's also false. We kind of know, we see change happening all the time. We just don't understand it that well. Turns out that when you do the kind of work that I do, what I do is I go and I observe people when they're trying to change something before we know if it's going to succeed or if it's going to fail. I just observe them as they're doing it. Turns out when you study change that way, what you observe is a very, very different story than the retrospective accounts that we usually get from traditional accounts. What you find are stories where there are actually a lot of people who are dissatisfied and who are working on changing things collectively. There's a lot of people. And there's a set of steps that you have to follow when this is hard work, right? Nobody has done this before. It's extremely difficult. And so there are all these people trying to do this together. Turns out that as they're doing it, they're screwing up. There's a lot of failure happening. Now, mind you, when somebody tells a retrospective account, they tend to omit those failures. And they tend to omit the people who were also part of the process and who just didn't succeed. We just lost them, right? We lost them from the analysis. We didn't quite observe them at the end. And so I think there's a couple of reasons why it's critical to understand that failure is an inherent part of any process of change. The first is that it turns out that in all the studies that I've done, in all my research, people always tell me, you know, if it wasn't because I failed or that other person failed, we would have never come up with the right solution. It was through that failure that somebody revealed a fundamental flaw in the way we were thinking about things, or a fundamental flaw in one of our assumptions. And we're thankful and we're lucky that that person tried it, or that I tried it and I failed, because that's how we learn what not to do. And that becomes a critical step. So number one, it's really important to understand and to observe failures because we learn a lot from them. But number two, I can promise you, the only thing that I systematically observe when I see differences between people who make it to the end as the sort of the hailed like leaders or the hailed success stories versus the people who fail, the only difference is often luck. Luck very often plays a role. But the only other difference that I see is resilience. What did they do when they failed? How prepared were they to fail? How much did they plan for failure or prepare for failure? That makes a huge difference. I'm gonna finish very, very soon. And so, when I talk about resilience, I'm not talking about being stubborn and then, like, if you fail, just try it again. If you fail, just try it again. That's not a particularly enlightened way of approaching these problems. What I'm talking about is having an approach where you recognize that because you're trying something that is very, very hard, you're extremely likely to fail. Because that's true, then plan for the longer term. How do you interpret your failure? Do you interpret it as a final act? Do you interpret it as part of a longer process that is leading you to a bigger outcome? Number two, how are you approaching this task? Are you approaching this task with the arrogance that you think you figured this out before anybody else has? Or are you approaching this with humility and saying, this is a really difficult problem and I'm likely to encounter some form of failure. Therefore, let me set up my actions in a way that will let me learn from failure and adapt to it without losing my ability to keep going. Let me not bet everything on the new things that I'm trying out. Let me run it more as an experiment than as a final push, so that if and when things don't work out the first time, I can just learn from it as much as I possibly can, and I still have the energy, the resources, the ability to keep going. And I want to connect with something that both of the previous speakers mentioned. If you notice in what they said, there's an element there of humility, of accepting that things are changing faster than you can possibly predict, that the systems are much more complex than you can predict as well. So approaching these complex problems with humility actually makes you more resilient to failure. Because you prepare for it and because you know what to do when it comes. And so I just want to leave us with this thought that maybe instead of avoiding failure, which is kind of the topic of the conference, we just need to reframe the way we think about failure and how we approach especially innovative activities or times when we want to change something, and how we think about failure in that context.
All right, excellent. All right, and our last speaker is Dr. John Nagl, Senior Fellow at the Center for New American Security and Minerva Research Fellow here at the U.S. Naval Academy. Lieutenant Colonel Nagl was a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Military Academy in 1988, subsequently earned his doctorate at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar. Dr. Nagl served as an armored officer in the U.S. Army for 20 years. His last military assignment was as commander of the 1st Battalion, 34th Armor at Fort Riley, Kansas. He also led a tank platoon in Operation Desert Storm and served as the operations officer of a tank battalion task force in Operation Iraqi Freedom, where he earned both the Combat Action Badge and the Bronze Star. Dr. Nagl served on the faculty of both West Point and Georgetown University, and is the author of a book, which the title is very intriguing, Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife. And that title alone requires us to listen to him. So please help me welcome him.
Thanks, Brad, and thanks to all of you for having a West Point guy here to talk. I think it displays a great sense of humor that you've got me here talking about leadership, although it's more likely than having me talk about football. I'm going to talk to you today, and for those who don't know, it hasn't been a good decade for the Army football team against these guys. We'll get them next decade. I'm going to talk to you today about 2 wars and 2 books, one of which has already been mentioned. I've got another war and another book in reserve for question and answer. I'm not going to talk about leadership in battle because I didn't do much of that. I spent most of both wars in the fetal position. But I'm going to talk about intellectual leadership and in the aftermath of wars after I'd uncurled myself. So I graduated from West Point in 1988 when the Cold War was still pretty warm, and went from West Point to Oxford for finishing school. And while I was at Oxford studying international relations, the Berlin Wall collapsed and the world turned upside down. I left Oxford in the summer of 1990. Saddam Hussein, as Storm and Norman Schwarzkopf, now deceased, mentioned, not a great strategist, also not a great intelligence officer. If Norman had realized that I'd graduated from Oxford and been assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division, he obviously would have made a different choice. But not knowing that, he invaded Kuwait in the summer of 1990, and I got to fight in my first war as a tank platoon leader. It was a great little war. We took the Iraqi army from the 4th largest in the world to the 2nd largest in Iraq in a period of about 100 hours. And afterwards, as I reflected on what I'd seen, on the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the very rapid defeat of the Iraqi army, a very potent force, by the American military and our allies and friends, I became convinced that we were seeing a paradigm shift, that the world had changed. And we talked a little bit earlier about the rate of change increasing in the world, and I think that's absolutely right. And so when after Desert Storm, the Army sent me back to Oxford to get my PhD, because we all make sacrifices for national security, I decided to look not at the tank-on-tank kind of warfare I'd been involved in, but at a different kind of war that I thought was now more likely. I decided to look at insurgency and terrorism, an ancient form of war, because I was convinced that our enemies will have noticed what happened to the Iraqi army when it tried to confront the United States military in direct frontal engagement, and decided that didn't work out so well for them. Let's try something else. And so I wrote the book, which Brad mentioned, Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, Counterinsurgency Lessons from Malaya and Vietnam, a book that is really a study on some of the topics that Rodrigo just talked about how organizations adapt to change. In particular, how do military forces learn to fight counterinsurgency campaigns? campaigns for which they are not necessarily organized, designed, trained, or equipped, situations for which their organizational culture does not necessarily suit them well. And I titled it after an observation by T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, the noted insurgent leader who actually felt sorry for the conventional army that was fighting against him and his band of Arab guerrillas. He said for them, war on rebellion was messy and slow, like eating soup with a knife, right? And I finished that book finished the dissertation in 1997. My masterwork on the likelihood that insurgency was going to be more important, and that therefore the ability to build military organizations that could adapt to that kind of war, rapidly learn how to fight that kind of war, was of growing importance in the international system, and I couldn't get the damn thing published, right? And that was the case for 4 years, and then suddenly after the attacks of September 11th, people were interested in the subject, and I was in fact able to bring it out as a book. Now in general, and I encourage you to do it in the conventional order, but in general people do research and then write books. In my case, I did it in the other order. So having written a book on insurgency, I got the chance to practice it for the first time in Iraq's Al Anbar province in 2003 and 2004 as the operations officer of a tank battalion, the 1st Battalion, 34th Armor, the Centurions. We had a hell of a fight. We lost 22, including 5 platoon leaders and a company commander. 22 killed in action overall from the 800 or so in our task force, 150 wounded, a valorous unit award. And by the end of our year fighting counterinsurgency, we were no further ahead than we'd been when we started. In fact, one of my battle captains printed up coffee mugs that said Iraq 2003-2004. We were winning when I left. We weren't, and we knew it. I got assigned from Iraq directly to the E-Ring of the Pentagon to go to work for Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz. The Pentagon was a big change from Al Anbar. You see it coming. In Anbar, I had some idea of who I was fighting against. Got reacquainted with one of my professors, one of my college professors, this guy named Captain David Petraeus, had been one of Cadet Nagl's professors. Even back then, I thought he was something pretty special. I was pretty sure he was going to make full colonel. Sat down with Petraeus and told him that we needed to write a new counterinsurgency field manual. He thought that was a pretty good idea and told me to get to work. And a year later, we produced the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual. Published on December 15th, 2006, downloaded 1.5 million times in the month after it was published, translated and critiqued on jihadi websites, copies found in Taliban training camps in Pakistan. So we knew our enemies were reading it. We just had to get our guys to do that, right? That began an information operations campaign that included getting it published by the University of Chicago Press, reviewed by Foreign Affairs and the New York Times, and perhaps most interestingly, taking it aboard The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, where I can personally guarantee you John and I had the funniest on-camera discussion he has ever had about an Army field manual. About a month after we published the book, Petraeus was assigned to take command in Iraq. He implemented the principles in that book pretty much to a T, changed, I would argue, the course of the war in Iraq. He had advantages. He was both lucky and good. More on that in Q&A, if you like. But a case of adapting a military organization which is inherently resistant to change and is resistant to change for good reason because the costs of getting it wrong are so very high. And so with that, I look forward to discussing with you the process by which Dave Petraeus drove that organizational change and whether it succeeded or failed in the third war that I didn't get to talk to you about.
All right. Excellent. I want to just reinforce all our speakers for being so brief. They did a terrific job, and now we've got a lot of time for exchange. I want to encourage the panelists to engage with one another. So we'll be getting questions. They may be directed to one or the other of you, but feel free to jump in and have some dialogue up here as well. So we've got 2 microphones. Phil, don't be shy about approaching the microphone. You've heard a variety of perspectives about change, how to think about it, including the idea that we certainly shouldn't avoid failure. Usually we think we should, but perhaps that's the wrong approach. So anyone want to kick it off with some questions for any of the panelists? I have rarely seen such a quiet group. All right, here we go. Some movement. Yeah, and feel free to just cue at the microphones if you'd like to do that. So go ahead.
Oh, okay. Hi, I'm
Sure.
Sabina, and I go to Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio. My question's for Mr. Dave Gardner. You were talking about how an individual or company should always change the game. How have you done that currently, and how do you persuade others in your company that this was a good choice?
Thank you very much. And I would say that let me step back for a brief sec. I said earlier I would name the person who talked about Egypt right through to today. It's Ray Kurzweil, who's a futurist and future thinker. I think a big part of changing the game and making sure that you're doing so confidently is starting from a very small and humble position. And that's easy for entrepreneurs to do. I know I've talked to a few of you already, and I know a lot of you are thinking about starting a business at some point. I think that one of the best books I've read on innovating, and boy, I feel like it really got me ready for Rodrigo and John's comments as well as Craig's, because I feel like we're saying a lot of the same thing, and I think that's important. But it's a book called Little Bets, and it's by Peter Sims, and I would highly recommend it to you all. It starts off with Chris Rock, the comedian, putting together a routine, and it's not what you'd think. Chris Rock is there at a small dive bar somewhere in New Jersey, and he has a yellow legal pad, and he's haltingly, in a way that you would never expect from this famous comedian, haltingly tossing a line or two out there and seeing what his small audience that didn't expect him to show up would say, how they would react. And the ones that worked, he would put a check mark next to, and the ones that didn't, he wouldn't feel too bad about it. He would fail quickly. He was prototyping. These are lots of the ways that I think the game changing needs to happen. So I feel like I did a decent job, and I think we all did, talking about how that's important. I think your question, some of the questions I hope will be about kind of how. How does that actually happen? What does it look like? And I don't know if I'm doing a great job answering your questions, Sabina, but I want to say that the approach, Little Bets in 30 seconds, basically, and I tried to document it, this is from my own personal notes of the book because I think it's compelling. Identify your goal or purpose as you make your little bet. Identify your goal or purpose, break it into constituent parts, make them as small as possible. Don't think of a startup, think about an application, or think about what your first employee to build out a team, because as maybe Craig said, paraphrased, there are no perfect people, but there can be perfect teams. So break it down into constituent parts, and then next, set up affordable losses. The affordable loss principle is all about failing and failing quickly. Just make sure that you're making sure those losses are affordable. And with that in place, expect to get things wrong at the start. That should be your expectation from the get-go. Fail quickly to learn fast, prototyping in order to think. Fail quickly in order to think. And that's a real principle of the Stanford D School, their design school there, which is maybe more compelling these days than Stanford MBA for a lot of people who are thinking about innovation and changing the world. So again, I hope some of that was helpful.
It was.
I did at least want to stick in the Ray Kurzweil name because I did definitely owe that point to Ray.
Thank you so much.
Others?
Yeah.
Others?
Anyone else? Rodrigo?
One thing I'll add to that, and I think that's is this on? I think so. I think that's a fantastic way of framing it, and I do like that book very much, the Little Bets book, and it connects with this question of how do you deal with, what does it mean to sort of enact these things in an organizational environment. The one thing I'll add to what David just said is when you're making these small bets, you want to make sure that you set them up in a way that you can actually learn what went wrong, right? Meaning, when you're making a small bet, if there are 10 moving parts to it and the thing doesn't work, then it's really hard to know which one of those 10 things didn't work. Right? So you want to set up these small bets in a way that you're only testing one specific question. Right? And so it really is a tiny, tiny bet, because then if it works, then you know that question you've resolved. If it doesn't work, then you know exactly why it didn't work. Right? And so setting up these small bets in a way that, regardless of like whatever the outcome, you can actually learn maximally from it, and you learn what works and what doesn't, is a way to think about these problems.
I'm just going to add one more thing to these great recommendations, and this is something you can start now. Build and maintain your networks. So you're going to need venture capital to make a bunch of these little bets. If they're going to be big enough to be statistically significant, you need a network of people who believe in you and who trust you to enable you to do that, and to build initial enthusiasm. So networking is absolutely essential to success in almost whatever you do. Having a group of committed, talented people who believe in you and who will work with you and support you is something you can actually start working on this week right here.
Thank you so much.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Abby. I'm from the University of Pennsylvania. My question is for anyone on the panel, but mostly for Mrs. Malloy and Gardner. As a graduating senior, I'll be joining the workforce in a few short months. In a rapidly changing market, what are possibly the 3 top skills a college graduate should have in order to be adaptable and even attractive to employers?
Well, since you named me, I will start, but I know there's more wisdom than I have, certainly on this panel. So I'll be real quick. 3 attributes that I'm looking for anybody who applies the Motley Fool. We have, number 1, an understanding of our organization. I think we turn away, well, at least for summer internships this year, we had 250 applications for 10 places. That means we're turning away 96%. And of course, there's so many wonderful people, some of whom grew up reading our books as teenagers. Now we're old enough as a company that they can apply to come work for us as an intern or a permanent position. And for every 10 great ones, if one of them knows the history of our company, has been active on our website, has been learning, studying, and showing their passion for what we're doing, it's just as my son who'll be applying for college, and it sounds like you already got into Penn, so you did pretty well. Just as he's been coached by the counselors there, it's always, why the University of Pennsylvania? And if you write an answer to that question, filling out your application, and you could copy and paste that for any other school, that's not the right answer. It's the same thing. So knowledge of the organization that you're applying for. The other 2, real easy. Number 1, optimism. I guess I should say number 2. Number 2, optimism. I believe that optimism isn't just a state of mind, it's a creative force. I think that, Henry Ford, whether you think you can or whether you think you cannot, you're right. And finally, number 3, I would say flexibility and being ready to evolve and being intellectually curious in a sense. Craig? Or anyone else?
Yes, I had the opportunity to hire hundreds of people over the past 15 years in all functional areas: sales, marketing, finance. And I think the attributes you hear over, lots of the famous stories about interviews at Google or interviews at other companies, whether this process. The people that I always want to bring into my organization, number 1, are they smart? Are they intellectually curious? That's a really key point. And that doesn't mean did they have a 4.0 in college? That doesn't always correlate. But are they smart? Are they intellectually curious? Are they motivated? Do they really want to come in and work and learn? And then there's a real cultural fit part to that as well. There's a kind of a sort of famous book. I hope I can say it in here. It's called the No Asshole Rule, where you can't have those people in your organization. You just can't have people that are disruptive. You need to find people that will work collegially and want to work within a team. But those are 3 key things that I certainly look for when I'm hiring people for my companies.
I ran the Center for New American Security, a Washington-based think tank, for 3 years before coming here, and hired a lot of people in just your category, just your sort of age group. Penn is absolutely a great credential. And let me echo sort of some of the things that have already been said, maybe say them slightly differently. I look for people who have overcome adversity in their life and show that determination. That everybody is going to face setbacks. How do you deal with setbacks, I think, really determines what your character is made out of. Team players was the positive way. I said the no assholes rule. My center was actually founded by Michelle Flournoy, later the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, highest ranking woman ever in the Pentagon, and a likely future Secretary of Defense. Michelle, although she wouldn't say it in those words, established a no assholes rule at CNAS. You've got to be fun to work with. You have to be positive. You have to make people want to be on your team and be happy to be on their team. And finally, more specifically to my field, with something again that you can get started on right now, reading and writing skills are absolutely essential. And if you haven't published, don't bother coming into my world. And the beauty of that is you can publish as an undergraduate. It's easier to publish now than it ever has been. Start with book reviews, but publish. Get out there and get your ideas known.
Sounds like you just got advice on how to get jobs at 3 different places.
Thank you.
Was that useful for you?
Very.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Excellent. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Chris Bonnell. I am a finance and English student at the University of Nebraska. This is directed towards Mr. Gardner, and others may speak to this as well. I'm interested in hearing your perspectives on management and leadership, and setting some of the more speculative investing aside. How do you gauge leadership qualities in individuals and management teams when you have never met them, and what kind of emphasis do you place on that for the future of a company?
Again, I'll give a brief answer. Thank you very much for an excellent question that deserves a long answer but time is always short. So I think there are 2 things that I look for, and I am constantly in the process of vetting management and leadership teams. That's what we do as investors, right? We could invest in Netflix or we could invest in Blockbuster. What are the characteristics that we're looking for from the people ultimately that are underneath or behind those services, products, marketing? Because it's the people that you're really buying if you invest for the long term, which is our approach. The 2 things that stand out for me, number 1, a sense of purpose and purpose-driven leadership. I think that it's easy to say, it's much harder to do, especially when things go against you. And if I think about someone like John Mackey at Whole Foods, or we think about Reed Hastings at Netflix, those are guys who've been on the front page of the Wall Street Journal as having screwed up in a huge way, each within the last 5 or 6 years, and yet in both cases, they bounced back. We've heard a lot about resilience. It's also true. Winners are losers who didn't quit. So number 1, purpose-driven leadership, and then number 2, I love to find culture creators and culture builders. Again, when I buy a stock, I'm there probably for 10 years or more. That's how I think about it. So I'm choiceful on the front end, and I don't make too many choices on the back end. I don't sell very often. So that means I'm kind of I'm marrying not just a group of people that could change, but the culture of the company underneath it. So we think about winning cultures. I think I've already thrown out a bunch of names. We can think of the military and what amazing culture you all participate in and create every day. It is those things that you would say are true of working there or being there that are unique to that organization. There are a whole bunch of public companies out there that don't exist long enough to even build up a culture, but the ones that have a real sense of an authentic way about them, even within early years as startups, those are the things I look for. So, and that can only be created by real leadership.
I mean, this question of management and leadership is something that we think about a lot at the Yale School of Management. It's one of the things that we try to differentiate ourselves on. I'm just going to focus on one thing, and I think that one of the ways in which both business education and a lot of the way in which our economic system currently works have messed up, is that we have a lot of folks in organizations, and I was talking to the folks who drove me here about this in the car. A lot of the folks who are in the organizations out there have been trained and have been socialized to think that managerial decisions are simply technical decisions, meaning you just need to run the numbers, figure out the economics of the decision, figure out which of the different possible outcomes is going to maximize shareholder value, and that's all you need to do. And to me, that is not what management like leadership and management means. And connecting to what David is talking about, what I think are successful, effective business leaders are people who understand that every decision has a human component to it as well, and has an ethical component to it as well. And there's a technical component to our decisions, and it's important. It's important to run solid analyses and to understand the numbers and to run the numbers in a careful and rigorous way. But it's equally important to think about the human dimension of every single choice that we make, because organizations at the end of the day are made of people. And that is what truly ends up mattering, and that's what truly ends up determining the success of an organization and how that organization operates in the world. And so to the extent that managers incorporate that component, the ethical, the human component of decisions in every decision that they make, is the extent to which I would recognize them as a leader.
Rodrigo inspired me to tell a quick war story. I met my tank platoon before Operation Desert Storm, actually in the sand in Saudi Arabia. The platoon had a platoon leader who the first day he took the tanks touched sand, pulled out from the port. He decided that he couldn't do it, and he quit. And they sent me out to meet this platoon in a combat zone. And the guys were all leaning up against the tank, 15 guys, 4 tanks, and meeting them for the first time. And I gave my little "this is me" talk and a little bit of my philosophy of leadership, and asked any questions. And one of the guys said, "Yes, sir, I got a question. Did they tell you we were the worst platoon in the battalion or in the whole brigade?" I said, "They said the brigade." And that just changed. And I don't know where that came from exactly, and as I mentioned, I spent most of the war curled up in the fetal position. So it was the only good line I had the whole war. But the importance of believing in the team and pushing the team and doing more than managing, we could have a long talk about the differences between managing and leading, and I think managing focuses on return on investment, but leadership focuses on developing the people. And if you're able to do that, able to look beyond just the immediate return on investment to build people over the long term, that's a great way to build networks of people who will later fall on hand grenades for you, in some cases literally.
Just wanted to add one thing to that. You know, when I'm looking for leaders or hiring leaders within my companies, it's often kind of the opposite of what you would expect. Maybe it's, you know, I'm not looking for presence or swagger or you know, someone who's got a loud voice. For me, it's more about respect for their people, respect for the organization, respect for our customers, a sense of humility, of persistence, a sense of servant leadership, that your people are first, that your success will come from your people's success. And you know, for me, that is always the most gratifying when, for instance, when one of our companies was sold, and you know, and people who have worked there for a number of years, you know, made enough money to pay off their children's education or their house, or, you know, change the trajectory of their life. And for me, that was almost more satisfying than, you know, the accomplishment of the business. I think, you know, if you can put your people's success before your own, then that's you're on the way to becoming a successful leader.
Thank you.
Right, yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Taylor, and I'm studying History, Education, and Leadership at Marietta College. And my question is for the entire panel, but it's actually about something Mr. Gardner said a little bit ago. You said there are no perfect people, but there are perfect teams. And I was just wondering if you had any advice as to how to build a perfect team.
Thank you for the question. I think that I have very little experience relative to a few others on the panel, so I would really love to hear from them. It's a great question. I guess I will just offer that I tend to think about, you know, I think thinking in systems is a good way of thinking about lots of things. I'm an English major, and I have no graduate degree, so on the face of it, I'm not really a traditional systems thinker. There's a good book, by the way, by Danella Meadows called Thinking in Systems that I recommend. little bit heavy toward the end. But, you know, I think that I look at an investment portfolio and I see a football team. I see that we need to have a minimum of 11 stocks. I think we should have 4 or 5 big, stable, let's call them linemen. I think we should have, you know, some fast, risky, run down for the bomb wide receivers. I think we should have a few stars in the backfield. And I think we should probably have a quarterback who's helping define kind of the approach that I'm taking. So that's how I see an investment portfolio. And when I think about a team, I think you have to figure out what are the positions before you write in anyone's name. It's not so much about hiring your best friend Biff or Jennifer, who was top in your class in high school. I think it's more about understanding ahead of time X's and O's and what are the boxes, and making that choiceful decision about what the team, how it will interact, and then you start figuring out who has the skill sets to do that. So a little bit of systems thinking. I don't know if that's helpful.
A response to teams, yeah? Rodrigo? Oh, I missed it. Yep.
Yeah, in terms of building a team, I guess I don't think about it as a perfect team. It's maybe back to what I mentioned at the beginning. Is you as the leader need to understand deeply what your defects are, where your flat spots are, where your weaknesses are. I mean, my own example is I'm not a super detailed oriented person, but for the past 16 years in all of my companies, I've had the same CFO who's incredibly detail oriented, and I'm kind of a cockeyed optimist. I think you have to be in my line of work. My CFO, who's the super detailed guy, is a total curmudgeon, and we're a good balance. We learn how to do that, and then we try and add other people in the team to build those capabilities. And I make lots of hiring mistakes. I mean, you know, I recently moved someone from California to Texas to be the vice president of marketing in our company, and as soon as she opened her mouth in the first meeting, I knew it was the wrong choice, and I had to let her go a month later. And earlier in my career, I would have let that person stay on the team because I would have felt bad about it. But it's not fair to her, it's not fair to the company, it's not fair to our investors, it's not fair to her teammates. So you need to be able to adjust. It's about making those small risks, and a small risk can be someone on your team as well. And if that person is not a fit, one of my favorite business books is Good to Great, and one of the author's things: get the right people on the bus and the wrong people off the bus. And you really need to think about it like that.
All right.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, Cadet G, United States Military Academy. This question is for Dr. Canales, but I'm also interested to hear from the Academy graduates as well. The academies are about innovation, but they're also about very deep-rooted tradition. And my question is, how can a leader stray from tradition and make changes to an organization without destroying their career or kind of stepping out of his lane?
Very important question. That's a great question. And I think exactly. So especially when you're thinking about large organizations with a long tradition. Again, these are organizations that are defined by their stability, right? They have a tradition because they're stable, and people recognize that, and they see it as a value. And so changing that is inherently complex. And I think one of the things that I often say to my students, so I teach innovation, right? I teach the class of innovation, and so I'm always pushing them to innovate and to take risks. But I'm very explicit in saying the last thing I want is to create martyrs in my class. I don't want you to sort of go out like a moron and just blow yourself up trying to change something just for the sake of changing it, right? I think you've heard folks in the panel here talk about, number one, having a very clear sense of purpose. Why is this change necessary, really? But number two, I think you have to have very deep respect for the organization you're trying to change, and a very deep understanding of why that organization operates the way it does, right? the most common mistake that I see people make when they're trying to change organizations is that they underestimate the reasons why things operate the way they currently do. Turns out most of the processes within organizations have very, very good reasons why they're there. And you need to understand them deeply if you're trying to change them. For two reasons. Number one, any individual person trying to go against a whole organization and attack one of the core elements of that organization is going to get destroyed immediately by the organization. That's the job of the organization, to defend what it does well. Right? But number two, you may succeed and you may actually make things worse, right? If you don't truly understand what that thing that you're trying to change is there for. Right? So you have to start from a place of deep respect and deep understanding of why things are the way they are. Once you see that, I think this approach of making small bets is kind of the way to go for a variety of reasons. Number one, it allows you to do things that are relatively risk-free or have very small risks, and people are much more comfortable taking small bets than big bets. In many cases, within large organizations, you may run some of these experiments or make some of these bets without people necessarily noticing, which is perfect, right? Because then you don't even need to ask for a lot of permissions to do this. And then as you start finding successes, then the successes of those very experiments are the very things that are going to allow you to sell your idea and to convince others that this needs to happen in a grander scale. And so, again, number one, understanding deeply the way the organization works and why it works that way. And number two, being very careful about and very experimental about how you try to do these changes. And again, going back to what we said before, setting up these experiments in a way that maximizes your learning as you're going through them, and only increasing the bets as you see things working and you validate some of the assumptions that you're making. I think that was a bit too academic, but I'm sure they're going to give you examples of how it works.
So three quick thoughts that are maybe a little more on the ground. One of them is I've already talked about, establish networks and use your mentors in the organization to multiply the effects of your work. Understand the points of leverage inside the organization. Some positions are more powerful than others, and some individuals are more powerful than others, even they're influencers, even if they're not necessarily in a position of influence. And third, and I'm going to keep coming back to this, write and publish. The value of an idea in writing is immense. That an idea, I believe, doesn't really exist until you've written it down. And once you've written it down and gotten it published in some place like a business review, your credibility goes way, way up.
I think Rodrigo had it there, was spot on with that. I think, you know, approaching it from a position of respect and humility, and also, you know, deep expertise and understanding. You know, be prepared. Don't, you know, have credibility. And sometimes that takes time to build up credibility. It'd be hard to, you know, walk in as a second lieutenant to your platoon on day one and make, you know, radical changes because you're a bit of an outsider. But as you're there and people earn respect for you, and you have a deep understanding of how the organization works, and then you can start working on those small incremental changes and failures and experiments and rifle shots before you make a big change.
And you would agree, graduate before you become a rule breaker, right? So, did you get what you needed?
Thank you, gentlemen.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Commander Bow Wheaton from the Royal Navy, United Kingdom. Can I first of all just say how nice it is to be surrounded by so many British flags in this auditorium. I was fascinated by several of the panel's comments about the pace of change of technology and the ability of leaders to be able to cope with that and to have business plans that can adjust accordingly. I've been working in acquisition for a few years now, and I'm particularly interested in the fact that the large acquisition programs that the Royal Navy is going through at the moment, and also for that matter the United States Navy, typically take between 10 and 15 to even 20 years to come to fruition. and there therefore must be a distinct risk that these major programs could become operational and then redundant in a very, very short space of time. So I was wondering, perhaps for John Nagl to kick off, please, what his thoughts are on this, and if he could offer any advice to the senior leaders in acquisition as we go forward in this very, very fast pace of change environment.
Yeah, there have been literally, I think, 76 major studies of acquisition, proposing acquisition reform for the United States Department of Defense over the last 20 years. Many of them have recommended very similar things, as you might expect. None of them have had any impact whatsoever on the system. The United States, in many ways, the United States in the West won the Cold War, defeated the Soviet Union because our product cycle, although slow, about 15 to 20 years, was 50% faster than theirs, which ran about 30 years. By 3 iterations, we were a full generation ahead, and they could never catch up. We have not applied the capabilities of the information revolution to defense acquisition, and we have allowed politics to impede progress in an extraordinary way, to the point that the major acquisition programs the United States is running now, with perhaps the notable exception of the Virginia-class attack submarine, which does deliver on time and under budget, are delivering years over budget and at multiples of their expected cost. The answer is going to demand, I think, near system failure in order to get people's attention. That's the bad news. The good news is, as you may know, the United States is facing the possibility, and according to Paul Ryan, House Armed Services Committee Chairman, the probability of sequester in our defense budget here on the 1st of March, and then the possibility of a government shutdown at the end of March. So the disaster may be coming. So we've got that going for us.
Anyone else? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yep. You bet.
I guess the one thing that I'll ask a question for you. So often, the toughest questions I get are always from military organizations, because, I mean, that's the hardest thing to change in the world, right? What would an experiment look like within your organization? What would sort of a small version of what you envision needs to happen in military acquisitions, what would a small version of that look like? Is there any kind of small experiment you can do to start showing people, like, you see, when we do this, good things happen? And I've managed to convince certain people in certain military organizations to run small-scale experiments, and with some very good successes. And so it's just something to think about. Like, you know, sometimes waiting for people to understand and for the political process to play out, and waiting for the catastrophic failure to strike. I mean, it's a huge risk that we're taking. Right? And so, is there anything we can do to sort of show that there is a better way? Show it in a way that people kind of don't even notice that you did this, but now you can prove that there's something to be said for an alternative.
At the risk of going down a technological answer rather than a leadership type answer, I heard a lot of talk when I was doing my master's degree on open systems architecture, and I heard a lot of industry giving a lot of promises, but I haven't actually seen industry ever deliver something that's genuinely an open architecture to the military. What they love to do is give us something that's pretty bespoke. It's almost impossible to integrate it with anything else that's out there, and therefore costs the nation millions, if not billions, to sort it out. So maybe if we had stronger leadership in acquisition, forcing them to go down an open architecture route, we might have a solution.
Thank you. Good. Go ahead.
Hey guys, my name is Jimmy Miller. I'm an accounting major at Lehigh University. My question is directed towards Mr. Gardner. As a startup of the Motley, when you were first starting up, I guess, what sort of leadership skills did you feel helped you create a team that, you know, you thought would eventually be successful? And along the way, as like access to financial information has become easier and easier with like technology advancements, how have you learned anything new about leadership?
Great questions. I think that, first of all, when you're a startup, and I've only ever done one, so there are, again, people with a lot more experience than I have, but when you're a startup, I think the number one thing that you need to do is prove out at that early stage, select the right business model, and get past, get into where you're sustainable. So it's a struggle for any small enterprise. Are you going to run out of cash first, or are you going to make cash before you run out of cash? So that is always going to be about demonstration of your product or service's ability to perform for people. For us, we were in a unique situation. The internet was just being born. One of my early interviews was on CNN, and it was, coming up, we're going to have somebody who's an entrepreneur, the Motley Fool, and he's going to say people will use their credit cards on the internet back after this. And that was truly where the world was back in the mid-1990s. The whole idea of e-commerce was under extreme skepticism. So you have to, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, you have to prove out and show. For us, we believe that the stock market is a good thing. It is an ownership culture, and it gives you and me the opportunity to be part owners of the best businesses of our time. So for us, we had to pick stocks right in front of people. So from the first day, when we launched the Motley Fool, we basically said, we're buying the following stocks at the following prices, and here's our money, and we're going to do it right out front of you. Transparently, you're going to see all of our mistakes and all of our successes. And so here I am, just about to enter our 20th year, and every single pick that I've made is fully accountable and open to anybody who wants to join our services and see. So I think there's probably no substitute, whatever the individual context we're talking about, for proving out and you know, showing that you're secure enough to back with a guarantee or with your own transparent reputation what you're saying or trying to do. One other thing I'll mention, I love people who have a lover's quarrel with the world, or in this case, with their industry. A lot of the time, the great entrepreneurs are people, this was, by the way, this is on Robert Frost's gravestone, I had a lover's quarrel with the world. It's a lovely phrase. And if you really think about the people who come in and shake up how things are being done, at least in the context of business that I know, it's people who are visionaries who say, there's got to be a better way. You know, go back to Netflix. Late fees, having to drive it over and back. I know it sounds silly. Let's try this through the mail. There's got to be a better way. And that same mentality also took Netflix now into streaming. There's got to be something beyond the DVD, right? So having a lover's quarrel with the world and having an answer for it and backing it up are probably key forms of early leadership. Others?
50th anniversary of Robert Frost's death today, so very nice. My one sentence, in business school, they will teach you focus on profit and loss. As an entrepreneur myself, running a startup think tank, it's all about the cash flow, right? If you're net positive at the end of the year, but you ran out of cash 6 months earlier, it doesn't matter. Cash flow.
Go ahead. No, jump in.
One comment on that. I've had the opportunity to start 3 businesses from scratch, which is very different than my experience as a military leader when I was, sent to the fleet as a division officer on a destroyer. I mean, here's your team, here's your equipment, here's the ship. Don't screw it up. Don't break anything. Don't kill anybody. But in a in a civilian startup world, where it's so tenuous, and you need to get a team with you. I mean, it's about really painting a vision that's bigger than you are. It's something that is important, that they can, is in changing your little portion of the world. It could be a giant world-changing idea, or just changing, a smaller portion of the world, but something that people can be passionate about, that they can rally around, that they can leap out of bed every morning to come work that, and that starts to build your culture and get the right kinds of people in your team. It's very important to be able to have that rallying cry that you're doing something that's bigger than yourself, that's going to have a positive impact on the world.
I regret to let you know this, but we're actually out of time. So I need. Am I about right? We're at 5 minutes. Okay. So I need to wrap this up. I hope you have found this to be really stimulating and interesting. I'm guessing if you're like me, many of the thoughts about avoiding failure that you heard here today probably were not what you expected, and I thought very, very helpful. Can you help me in thanking this terrific panel one more time?
Yes, please. Thank you, gentlemen, for giving us your time. On behalf of the Naval Academy and the Leadership Conference staff, we would like to give you these gifts as a token of our appreciation.